Yes, we're sprinting towards the finish line. We're going to have a nice conversation now with Nikos Stathopoulos. Welcome again, Nikos, from BC Partners Europe. Have a seat here. Nice to have you back with us again, Nikos. We're getting this annual kind of update from you. So, first of all, long-term investor in Europe over 40 years, your company. Where do we stand now with inflation, interest rates? How do you see things panning out now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. As you said, it's becoming an annual tradition of joining your sessions. Well, first of all, it's clear that we're experiencing structural higher interest rates, and we've seen this at the moment across the board. Interest rates, frankly, we have been experiencing a decade or more than a decade of, I would say, abnormally low interest rates, and these abnormally low interest rates has led to very high multiples. High multiples have led to high valuations. So the world had been experiencing very high valuation environment, and now we're seeing an adjustment, I would say a reversion back to the mean. When I started investing, the interest rates were substantially higher than where we are today, and the environment in the last decade was more, I would say, more abnormal. That has led to effectively going to a pre-GFC environment where we are having lower interest rates than the peak, but still higher than we were used to. I think on inflation, we see the inflation has peaked, there's no doubt, but during its course of being so high, it did impact substantially commodity prices, it impacted costs, it impacted the profitability of companies. And I think we're all expecting that inflation will continue at a relatively higher level that we've been used to in the past. And naturally, this will impact investment activity too.
Yeah, a bit stickier maybe in the US than Europe, and maybe even here, depending on some of the geopolitical political headwinds. So, so how is this affecting the global investment climate? That's the main question, I guess.
It's difficult to price risk in this environment by definition because we've seen the change in activity. I think it does require, investing as always requires discipline, it requires conviction. There's no doubt that with this environment we'll have to be much more selective on the type of sectors that we invest. I think asset selection has become even more important this time around because you can't be bailed out by an increase in multiples on valuations because of low interest rates. So the assets that you buy and the selection that you make on the companies that you decide to invest is of paramount importance. For us, the focus continues to be on buying defensive growth businesses which are not cyclical but have more secular growth behind them. And I would say we have, in this environment, you have to reduce a bit your exposure into direct consumer type of businesses where the consumer who has this discretionary spending does unfortunately get impacted with this higher environment. I think, frankly, the geopolitical risks and geopolitical events do impact as well our investing activity, which was a bit not the case for many, many years. But we cannot ignore what's happening, of course, in wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. We can't ignore what's happening in elections. 50% of the world's population is going to the polls this year. Actually, our country, UK, is going to the polls as we speak today. But the US is going in November. But it's not just the UK and the US. A very large part of the population. As we've seen, governments and leaders of the world do impact decision making, and they do impact policies, and these policies end up impacting actually the investment climate. So in this environment, I think we need to be much more agile, and we need to be much more alert on the type of industries and companies we invest in.
And what about Europe in particular, and how Europe is positioned geopolitically? Does that worry you? Are you concerned about Europe somehow being squeezed between these two other bigger blocs? Does that worry you? How do you see that affecting developments in the European economy going forward?
I'm not worried that Europe is squeezed between the two blocks. I'm more worried on the fact that Europe, from being a cradle of stability, frankly, and sort of democracy apart from everything else, has become more of a problem at the moment. And we see this in various ways. You see it, first of all, just the fact that we have a war happening in our own turf, in the European turf at the moment, for more than 2 years, should be a cause of concern. Brexit, actually, apart from creating a lurch, it has increased the sort of the nationalism effect, which we see it now, in my mind, spreading across some other European countries. And I think if you put together Brexit, the war, the energy crisis, a more general crisis of leadership that is being experienced at the moment in Europe, it is actually a cause of concern. And it's for the first time in the past, call it 30 years, I've been investing in our continent. I'm more concerned about how Europe is going to develop in that front. And I hope that it will come back to its old good days of being stronger as a continent. Because it's not a question of being squeezed, in my mind. It's the fact that Europe has become much weaker in the overall space and sphere of diplomacy, and certainly in terms of influencing what's happening in the rest of the world. So as an investor, it's impossible to ignore the fact that a lot of these exogenous effects are impacting the investment climate in the region.
Well, what about Greece? I mean, obviously Greece isn't insulated from what's going on in the rest of Europe, but it's become something of an outlier now with a more positive story. So, you know, is it mainly opportunities now here for investors rather than, you know, the risks that we've been talking about and problems all these years?
For all these years. Well, first of all, Greece has proven to be a great recovery story. There's no doubt. I think Greece has also become a much more of an outlier, not only on these things, but in terms of stability. And I would say also sort of the resilience that the country has shown. And that stability, sometimes we take it for granted, but as we've seen also in other economies, look what's happening in France at the moment or in other countries, that stability sometimes is massively underestimated. And I think the country has shown that it has proven to be much more stable and much more resilient than, frankly, a lot of its peers. I think what Greece also has substantially more growth reserves than some of the other countries. And that's why you see when you look at the GDP growth and other key indicators of the country, they're growing at almost double the pace of the rest of the European Union. And the reason is because it was coming from a lower base in a lot of cases. And of course, a lot of the initiatives that the government is taking in terms of reform, et cetera. So I think Greece has really become much more in the, I would say, in the core of investors' mind now as a European country with great human capital, which has a stable government, but also a stable economy. And you need both. Investors hate surprises, and when they have an economy that it's growing and it also has stability in terms of a political side, it really helps.
Okay, final question. The Mitsotakis government is a year into its second term, and I just want to give you 30 seconds to say what it's, from your point of view, what the reform priorities should be.
I think other people have spoken about reforms, so I'm not sure I need to elaborate too much on this, especially in 30 seconds. But I would say that the only thing I would encourage this government is continue to have the courage to act. I think the reforms that in the last 5 years the government has done have really been contributing to the growth of the country. It has really contributed to a lot of the things that were pathogens actually of this country. Justice that was mentioned before, bureaucracy and everything else are certainly should be at the top of the agenda. But for me, what's more important is for this country to change and really shift from being a recovery story to being a structurally growth story for the long term. And I think the momentum is behind Greece. The credibility is behind Greece. We've been discussing it for many years about what needs to change. There is a willingness and ability, especially of this government, to act. And I would encourage it to continue to find the courage to act, even also sometimes, which is not very popular, because what's been done it's clearly creating that growth momentum and being able to attract foreign investment, which is so critical for a country of our nature.
Well, thanks very much, Nikos. Thanks for your insights. And I think that's a nice segue, this conversation, into our final session of the day and the final session of the conference. So thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.